Welcome to another episode of Asian Ethnology Podcast. My name is Frank Quorum, and I'm co-editor of the journal. I'm speaking today with my co-editor of Asian Ethnology, Ben Dorman, who has been with the journal much longer than I have. Welcome, Ben.
Thanks, Frank.
How are you doing today?
I'm well.
All right, great. So I was looking over your life history, so to speak, and you had a rather interesting childhood. You did a lot of traveling as a toddler, didn't you?
Yeah, I was actually, so I'm Australian, but I was born in Papua New Guinea.
Wow.
My father was a civil engineer. This is in the days when Margaret Mead was actually there.
Wow.
Doing research in the 60s. My mother also worked for the Australian government. We lived there until I was 8 years old. And then my parents packed everything up, including myself and my sister, and decided to go travelling. And we flew to Darwin from Port Moresby. Then from Darwin we went to Bali, and then we travelled Java, Sumatra, across to Malaysia, down to Singapore. Then we flew over to Europe and travelled all around Europe in a van that was bought outside Australia House. So this is in 1973. And I didn't go to school for an entire year.
Wow.
Yeah, that was my education.
Oh, wow. So did any of those cultures rub off on you?
Absolutely. I mean, I was sort of, firstly, through the eyes of a child, Papua New Guinea was what I really knew. Australia was a foreign culture. I went there occasionally to my grandparents. But then when we hit Bali, Sumatra, these were just completely opened up my mind in many ways. I mean, what was the thing that I remember the most was the food. But I also remember I was very struck by, the different religions, the rituals and so on. And I recall being very taken by Buddhism, particularly at the age of 8. So, we'd go to Borobudur, places like that, and there wasn't Buddhism so much in Indonesia, but in other countries we went to, it seemed to be there was something that was of interest to me, and that sort of had an influence on my research later on.
Okay. So speaking of Buddhism, at what point did Japan then become an interest of yours?
I had entered into university doing the wrong degree and ended up running a bar. I majored in refectory studies.
Oh, wow.
And decided to drop out of that. And so I thought I actually wanted to go to a country and a place where I knew nothing. And so I kind of saved up my money, sold my car, and went to Japan and decided to just immerse myself in the culture here. I wasn't really studying here. I got a working holiday visa, which Australians could get, and lived in Kyoto actually, which was it was an amazing experience. I was there for 11 months.
So was Buddhism part of the attraction of Japan for you?
Yeah, I guess so. Like I said, I've always been interested in it, and so that that was kind of what brought me here originally. And then I just became completely fascinated by the way things worked in Japan, and continued on from there. And so I decided at 27 years old I'd go back to university. I went back and I studied Japanese language, culture, religion and politics, history. And so I did a degree in Asian Studies at Australian National University.
So after you got your PhD, then you came back to Japan, correct?
Yeah, I went back and forth to Japan on study, like exchange student, and then I went back to A&U, did my PhD.
And how did you end up here at the Nanzan Institute of Religion and Culture?
So before I was at the anthropological, I was at the Nanzan Institute for Religion and Culture from 2003 until 2016, and now I'm at the Anthropological Institute. Yeah, I first came to the Institute for Religion and Culture in the late 90s. I had just embarked on my PhD program. I had a 2-year fellowship here in Japan, and I spent 1 year at Nanzan and the other year at Tokyo University. It was really because my then supervisor, who was here, was looking at an area of religion and politics that I was particularly interested in as well. And so I came here and made connections here. and then for the second year moved to Tokyo, and then I went back to Australia to finish my PhD.
Okay.
And then once I finished my PhD, I was very fortunate. I got a position here at Nansan,
working with Peter Knecht on the journal, Asian Folklore Studies.
Yeah, so my position was associate editor for the two journals that were here at Nansan, not the only two journals, but the ones that were produced in this building, Asian Folklore Studies and the Japanese Journal of Religious Studies.
Okay, could you tell us a little bit more about the work you did for those two journals?
The work was fairly technical in the sense that you had copy editing and line editing and proofreading and so on. In addition to when I was working with Peter, we would be receiving very different submissions to what we receive now for Asian ethnology. And I'd be working very closely with the authors, doing developmental editing and so on with their work. And, we'd be doing layout of the journal and so on. And at the same time as I was doing those jobs for those journals, I was publishing my own academic work.
Tell us a little bit about your academic work.
So my PhD work was on new religious movements and how the Japanese print media reported them during the Allied occupation period. Mm-hmm. And I eventually published that as a book called Celebrity Gods, New Religions, Media and Authority in Occupied Japan. Mm-hmm. And the focus was really on these different new religions that had appeared in the post-war period, in the immediate post-war period. Mm-hmm. And this is, of course, with new religions, when do they become new, and who has that right to define? Mm-hmm. And I was interested in how the media definitions of new and religion and so on. A lot of the groups, if they can even be called groups, movements, kind of clusters of people who may gather around one particular person or an idea. They'd been around for a long time, and they were actually came from, often they had roots in Buddhism or Shinto or even Christianity in some cases. Mm-hmm. I was interested in how people who had healing abilities or would claim to be healers, how they gathered followers together, how they moved in society, how they were perceived by the outside society. Mm-hmm. So those are the types of things that I investigated. And the Allied occupation period is particularly fascinating to me because it was a time when all of a sudden Japan was they declared total freedom of religion. The largely American U.S. authorities. I mean, the Japanese constitution is one of the most unequivocal in terms of freedom of religion. It's very, very clear, as opposed to the pre-war period when there was a lot of government suppression of various religious groups.
I see.
And so that period it was a real period of chaos in a sense. The famous phrase was rush hour of the gods, where a whole bunch of new religious movements appeared, and they appeared in the press as well. So that's what I was investigating.
So you think it has to do more with the liberalization of religious practice than a response to foreign occupation?
I don't think so much.
It was a little bit of both.
A response to foreign occupation. The foreign occupation allowed groups to flourish with freedom in that sense. Yeah, in that sense it was. But I think the attitudes, maybe if I talk about the attitudes, I think they weren't freed up in a sense. I was also interested in the relationship between the authorities, that is the Japanese Ministry of Education's Religious Affairs section, and the occupational authorities, SCAP, Supreme Commander of the Allied Powers, as they were called, and how these three components, the new religions, the media, and the authorities interacted. Mm-hmm. I continued with that line of media representation and religion. I did some research on the effect of the post-Aum Shinrikyo years. So Aum Shinrikyo was the new religious movement that released sarin gas into the Tokyo subway system in 1995, Mm-hmm. And since that time, religion got a very bad name in the sense that people were even more suspicious than they were normally of religion. People during the post-war period or during the pre-war period, I mean, religion, Shinto in particular, was associated with nationalism, and which was most unfortunate because it isn't actually the claims that various groups made on behalf of Shinto do not bear out that it's a particularly nationalistic type religion. People simply rode on that wave of nationalism, and after the Allied occupation, Shinto got a particularly bad press for that. Even though Japanese people appear to be quite religious and there's all sorts of rituals, most people won't admit or even say that there is religion in Japan other than famous temples and art and so on. Aum Shinrikyo was a criminal group, or was a group that committed crimes. Certain members of the group committed crimes, and as a result, the fallback from that, or the fallout from that, was that it was difficult for other movements. Their reputation took a hit after all. So I did some research on the post-Aum Shinrikyo situation. There was a group called Panawave, which suddenly appeared in the press, and the press simply painted the picture of this group as being just like Aum, which couldn't be further from the truth, but the press grabbed it and rode with that story. And it really showed the lack of understanding within the press of what groups do, but really about how minorities, in a sense, are treated in Japan. I think that's a broader conversation that could be had about it. And I did some work on a very famous fortune teller who appeared on television during the 2000s. Early 2000s, Hosoki Kazuko was her name. She actually became somewhat of a style guru, a kind of Dr. Phil type figure who would impart advice onto various celebrities. The interesting thing about her was that she had a particular form of divination, and she made very specific claims that this had nothing to do with religion. What she was talking about was pure common sense from a Japanese culture point of view. And so she made this broad distinction between culture and religion, again, because this idea of religion as such is somewhat has somewhat of a negative reputation in Japan.
So you said these new religions aren't so new. What about now, post-independence, post-war, Japan, the modern period, contemporary period rather? Do you still see new religious movements arising and
sure.
At the same rate and pace as what you saw during the occupied period? Or?
Not at the same rate, not from what I've seen. I mean, there are ways of recategorizing stuff. Something that may have been called a new religion or a newly arisen religion, as they said at that time, maybe
Shinshukyo is the term.
Yeah. That's new religion, but
newly arisen
is Shinko Shukyo. So it's like a kind of, it has a faddish sort of fly by night type of flavor to it. You know, the terminology is very important, and So
are those terms still being used now?
Yeah, they are. Yeah, not so much Shinko Shukyo. They'll use that term as a newly arisen religion as a kind of pejorative term, but usually they'll talk about Shin Shukyo, new religion, or Shin Shukyo, which is actually it's probably a little bit old these days. When Aum Shinrikyo in the 1990s and all of that occurred, just before that there was this big thing about Shin Shukyo, the new movement. So you can see the problems with terminology there.
The new ones.
Yeah. Again, I think the way that these things are reported and presented in media has a very significant effect on the way that they're viewed in society and the way that they carry themselves in society as well.
So let's go back to the journal then. After Peter Knecht retired from the journal after so many years of dedication to it, you took over as editor. What happened then?
Yeah, well, so he retired, and the journal was in a state of flux in a sense because there was no successor. who was actually at the university to continue with the journal, but there was still a lot of people wanted the journal to continue, and he'd done such great work, built up an incredible body of connections and so on. And I, at the same time that I was here, Scott Schnell was here. Scott from University of Iowa, and we were discussing the journal and how we liked it, and we wanted to work with it and continue it. And so I was fortunate enough to get the position of editor of the journal here at Nunzon University. And Scott and I decided we made an arrangement where we'd set up this co-editor system. Mm-hmm. And so that's how we began. And we renamed the journal. I don't have a problem. It was Asian Folklore Studies. Personally, neither of us had any problem with the idea of folklore. After discussions with a number of people, yourself included, we thought that folklore was just one of those words that just wasn't really something we could continue to put out there. We were getting submissions from a much wider areas. When we wrote the first editorial, we spoke. I mean, I came from a background of Asian studies. I'm not an anthropologist, not a card-carrying anthropologist as such, but I've always been interested in the areas. Scott was anthropology, and so we wrote that we saw the journal as being kind of in the intersection of Asian studies, folklore studies, and anthropology, and I think that kind of opened up things quite a bit. Mm-hmm. And we brought in a editorial board when you first came on at that time, and just implemented a whole number of changes.
And so what are your goals for the future of the journal at this moment in time?
Yeah, I think that what Scott and I wrote is still, in my mind, still fairly clear. We always, in addition to pursuing those three areas, we always felt that the journal should be a place where the voices of people who aren't necessarily connected with major institutions can have their work considered and published at the same time as producing a high quality peer reviewed journal. So I'd like to continue that side of it. That's for me. Mm-hmm. I'm also interested in this podcast
yes.
because I think it's a different aspect for the journal that highlights the people who have made some contribution to the journal, but also people whose work I'm interested in particular, and other people who are connected to the journal are interested in.
So you've had an academic interest in media for some time now.
Yeah.
What can this kind of media, sort of acoustic media, internet and so on, add to the old-fashioned print version of an academic journal? Because Asian Ethnology is now more or less an e-journal with print on demand. So why do you see that as sort of a wave of the future and going electronic and adding all these new dimensions like podcasts and so on? Why do you think that's necessary for an academic journal in the 21st century?
Okay, well, I'll start. That's a good question. I mean, I think I'd start by looking at what an academic journal traditionally is, and of course, it's been like a printed journal is what both you and I were raised in. I think I can say. I mean, I always went to the library and I'd always look for a journal or a book, and I'd look at the book and then I'd look at the other books around that book, in the shelf, and that was where I'd started to get interest. But it's a different world these days. I mean, right. We are, libraries are getting full of printed volumes of things, and they're trying to get rid of stuff. At the same time, junior scholars are accessing material from journals in different ways. They're not going to libraries. I mean, I've spoken to people who have never actually held a physical copy of the journal. Mm-hmm. And I when I first heard that, because I mean, when I started working on the journal, I was raised on print, and I just believed in the idea of print, and I still do. But it's in order to meet the kind of the market these days, you have to work in different areas. So we've been producing the journal. The PDFs have been open access for a number of years, but now we've got a new website which material that's published in the journal is available on HTML through browsers and so on, and so that adds another dimension. And so people who don't want to, they can download the PDF if they want. I mean, in my day, I'd download the PDF and then I'd print it. But you talk to
Xerox,
but you talk to graduate students these days, and they just want to look at it online, and they'll get and so we moved in that direction. And I just think that it's really to reach different audiences. I mean, you can get information to a lot of people fast through, platforms, social media platforms, obviously Facebook, Twitter, things like that. I think a podcast is something where, we can get people to talk a little bit about what they do and what their interests are, and perhaps connect them to, links and things like that, and what they're talking about. It's just a more dynamic way of, and different way of dealing with areas of interests.
So journals are becoming multi-sensory then. They're bringing in the other senses, not just the visual sense. And now we're getting the acoustic dimension here with the podcast.
Yeah.
I'm wondering how one could make it even more sensorial.
Yeah, kind of like, I'm just...
adding scents, like incense, to give you the sense... The experience of being in a temple where sandalwood is burning or something like that.
Yeah.
How would one do that?
Yeah. I just had memories of John Waters.
Yeah.
He did that with one of his films, I think, in the 70s. Yeah.
So one thing our audience may not know at this point is that you're also a very dedicated musician, and you probably bring some of that sensibility into your media work as well, if I'm not wrong. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, I've always loved sound, and I've loved the mixing of sound, how sounds work together. When playing music, it's and I'm really pretty much a sort of a rock musician, I guess, but I appreciate all types of forms of music, and what I particularly appreciate about music is silence. Where people who particularly musicians who know when to stop and know when to listen and can pick that moment when to play. And they're the people I really gravitate towards, and that's the type of thing that I really appreciate. And so, I think that simplicity is also an important part of music. And I think that, because that's where the dynamics really come in, people's emotions and so on. Yeah, but now I'm mixing and so on, producing music through computers and so on. I was hoping to bring that in with this podcast so that I could combine my interest and also be able to talk to some pretty cool people about what they do.
So Asian ethnology is allowing you to integrate all these different interests of yours.
Well, it is at the moment, yeah.
That's good. Well, this has been really interesting, Ben, and I've been really happy to work with you over the last couple of years, and I'm looking forward to
great.
A long-term relationship with the journal in the future. Thank you so much for speaking with us today.
Thank you, Frank. You've been listening to Asian Ethnology Podcast. You can subscribe to Asian Ethnology Podcast through iTunes. Thank you for listening.